Starting a brand new section, 8.7. We're doing yet another strategy for solving quadratic equations. Remember, way back at the beginning, we said if they ask you to solve a quadratic equation, they are just asking you to find the zeros. We have already learned in 8.5, I taught you how to use the graphing. And that works really well if the zeros are integers. Sometimes you can get pretty close to it. You might actually be able to find with the trace button, get really close on it, maybe even on it altogether. Factoring, just remember, not all quadratics are factorable, and sometimes that's an effective way to find your answer. Sometimes factoring is a good idea if it's factorable. We learned that in 8.6. And then today in 8.7, these lessons we're going to encounter, we're going to use the square root property. That's our strategy. And remember, it only works if there's no bx term. If that middle term is missing, you can use the square root property all day long. Okay? Well, not all quadratics are missing their bx term, so that's why we can only sometimes use this strategy. This would be a good idea if there's no middle term. Let me show you example 1, what I'm talking about. If you have your squared variable on the left and just a single number, your constant number on the right, you can use the square root property. All you do is to get x all by itself, to undo a square, you would take the square root. Remember, the square cancels out with the square root sign, leaving me with just plain old x. And then the square root of 16, there's actually two numbers that I could get that are the square root of 16. 4 times 4 is 16, so one of my answers is positive 4. And negative 4 times negative 4 is also positive 16. So we're looking for two answers. Anytime you use the square root button, we're looking for two answers. So here, our two roots, our x-intercepts, if you so desire, are positive 4 and negative 4. So if I were going to graph this on my graphing calculator, or factor that, yes, it actually is factorable, I would get positive and negative 4, okay? Now, you're probably like, how do you know it's factorable? Well, first of all, I got integer answers, so I know for a fact it's factorable. First thing you got to do if you want to factor it is subtract 16. So you're going to end up with x squared minus 16 equals 0. Do you remember this is a difference of two squares? So when you factor it, you're going to have x plus 4 and x minus 4. And then when you zero out each quantity, you're going to have negative 4 and positive 4. So you see, some of these strategies are interchangeable. I could have factored it. I could have graphed it. It's definitely graphable, but I could use also the square root property. Okay, let's look at B, x squared equals negative 4. Well, I'm going to tell you right now, you cannot take the square root of negative number. You can't. Not in Algebra 1. Your teacher in Algebra 2 is going to show you how to do this, but we're looking for real number answers, not imaginary answers. And the square root of negative 4 would give you an imaginary answer. So there are no zeros here in Algebra 1. Okay, it's not going to cross the x-axis. Now, if I were going to try and factor that, remember we would want to bring that 4 over to the other side with the x squared, so I'd have to add 4 to each side. Do you remember what I said about the sum of two squares? That's right, not factorable. So there's no zeros, okay? No zeros here. All right, I'm going to leave the rest of these for you, because I think you've got the basic gist of how to do this, okay? The only one that might trick you up a little bit is D, but I think you'll figure it out. And I'm going to give you a point for C, D, and E. So see what you can do with that and bring your questions to class.